was missing. It was a quote from the Pope, so I'll have to make it up. This gospel today refers to Jesus living in a wild place with wild animals, and obviously no harm comes to him. It's an allusion back to the original days of creation. And the covenant with Noah reminds us of that. And I believe actually the first two readings are more important today than the gospel, so I want to unpack them a bit with you because the gospel does make an oblique reference back to them. And they make a reference to the gospel in the letter of Peter. What's going on? You found it. Thank you. Deacons are great. So, in the first reading, this story with Noah, I don't know if you paid close attention, but if you did, you would have noticed that God makes a covenant with three parties, not one. God does not just make a covenant with Noah. God makes a covenant with Noah, the creatures, and the earth. All three are specifically mentioned. And at the end of this, I want you to think about that. I'm going to give you something to think about. So God has a concern for humanity, for all living creatures, and for the earth itself. And so this covenant is made with all three. And Noah, as Peter reminds us in his letter, the story of Noah and the ark prefigures baptism. Why? Because all those living things were saved from the flood of water through the water. They all got in the ark and floated on the water, according to the story. So all are saved through water. As a Christian, that should ring bells in your head. Ding, 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 water, baptism, saved. Oh, I get it. Okay. So you should put those things together. This is precisely what is happening in the letter of Peter, that we are saved through water. And he says specifically, this story of Noah prefigures baptism. It gives you an image of it before it ever happened. But now we know about it. The salvation comes through the water. And Peter, in his letter, makes a reference also to the spirits in prison. And everybody scratches their head at that one and skips it and goes on to something that they can figure out. At the time of Jesus and at the beginning times of the early church, there was a book that was quite popular. It's not in the Bible. It's called the Book of Enoch. And there's a first Enoch and a second Enoch and so on. And people knew this book. And in this book, there's a story about this prophet hero guy named Enoch, who was sent by God to speak to the angels who rebelled against God. So God has put them in a sort of prison, if you will, that Peter makes reference to. And Enoch preaches to them. And in the Christian story, now, Christians have taken this book along, not in the Bible, but one of their books they're using to understand God. And they're beginning to apply that idea of Enoch to Jesus. That Jesus also, since he is God, has the authority over all creatures. Creatures include angels. Sometimes we forget that. They're created things. They're not God. So Jesus preaches even to them to teach them about, here is the fullness of God alive. And the fullness of God alive is so concerned with these material things of creation that are inferior to angels. God is so concerned with these things of creation that God saves them, that God favors them, that God favors animals and the earth and humans. If you remember back reading in Genesis, you'll recognize that the angels who rebel against God are jealous of us. Why? Because we are inferior creatures compared to them, but God favors us. This is why they rebel. God favors us, people. God favors us and the animals, all the creatures of the earth, and the earth itself. That's something to remember today. that God chooses to gather all this into salvation. We're told this again in the New Testament when we're told that there will be a new heaven and a new earth. It doesn't just say a new heaven. Everything will be caught up in the saving power of Christ. And all of that is symbolized by how we come through the water of baptism and are saved. All of creation will share in the glorious freedom of the children of God, St. Paul says, not just humans, all of creation. In this church, this new building, I hope you recognize some of that. We spent a lot of effort, for example, on using stone. It's an earth material. On concrete, it's made of earth material. The wood, all these kinds of things tell us that creation is part of this story too, this window behind me. That's why the animals are in there. I've had people ask me, it's because they don't really believe the teaching of St. Paul. It's about all of us living things. And God makes a covenant with all of this. I saw this in the Pope's encyclical, the recent one, Laudato Si', in which he says, the entire material universe speaks of God's love, his boundless affection for us. Soil, water, there's water back there, mountains, everything is, as it were, a caress of God. The history of our friendship with God is always linked to particular places which take on an intensely personal meaning. We all remember places, and revisiting those memories does us much good. All of creation, people, caught up in this beautiful covenant with God, that God makes with all of creation. And we heard about that in the reading today from the Old Testament. So, in order to act like we believe it, I would ask you over this week, why don't you make a covenant with all living things, with your man and woman, boys and girls, the animals, all creatures, and the earth. Why don't you make a covenant this week? We're reminded that God did in this first reading today. What about you? You're supposed to image God. Don't forget, this is the week to renew the covenant.